Okay, so that's a good overview of what's happening in the US. Overall, you do see a slowdown coming. You're not too sure if we're going to go into a recession or not. But overall, the US is not doing too bad. But why don't we look at Canada now, given that we both reside here in the city of Toronto? We all know what's going on with the housing market. And I want to get your views now on the Canadian economy and also the housing market. What's your take, and do you see any concerns?
Lots to be concerned about in Canada, both cyclically and structurally, right? So unlike the US, where you've had all these nice sort of stimulative effects, Canada's had none of them, and the economy looks incredibly weak to us. And in fact, we're surprised that the Bank of Canada has held away from easing for so long, because I think the economy is desperately crying out for it. So I can give you the kind of broad overview of all the effects going on, but I want to start with the structural stuff, because there's a lot that's gone wrong over the past few years, pre and post COVID, that I think has left the Canadian economy in as weak of a position already as it's been in some time. In fact, the only bright spot is that debt levels are somewhat below what we're seeing in the US and Europe, but that's really the only thing you can point to as somewhere where Canada is actually doing better than anyone else, right? So I think the key stat that everyone needs to know about Canada is that real income per capita is negative. It's declining, and it has been declining for a little while now. And that is telling you that living standards broadly are getting worse for people residing in Canada. Now, the reason for that is a combination of things. One of it is that growth has been very, very slow. And sort of hovering around 1%. Sometimes you get a little negative quarter, never enough to trigger an actual recession, but nothing to sort of build wealth and prosperity in the country. Why is it so low? Well, consumption isn't doing what it's doing in the US, but beyond that, we're just not seeing investment in the Canadian economy. Canada's a large net exporter of capital. Over the last 10 years, it's exported nearly $500 billion on net to the US and to the rest of the world. So there's not a lot of investment happening internally to sort of increase productivity.
1 second before you go on, I just want you to clarify that. When you say a net exporter of capital, what exactly do you mean?
Right. So if you look at direct investment flows mostly between Canada and the US, but really between Canada and the world, you have obviously some investment goes from the US to Canada, some investment goes from Canada to the US. You think of large private equity funds in Canada who will hold a majority portfolio in the US. But the sort of balance of those flows is that Canada basically invests outside of itself to a very, very large degree. And so it's earning some income back from that, but it's not developing capacity internally to the degree that it probably should be. Now, probably that you should have maybe a little bit of net export from developed markets to EMs, but not so much from DM to DM, and not to that degree, right? So that is earning some income flows into Canada, but at the cost of a higher productive capacity in Canada. And what we're seeing as a result is that productivity is completely flat and has been since 2015, right? There's been no gains in output per worker in Canada. And at the same time, the US is hugely up over that period.
Did you say since 2015?
Yeah, there's been a decade of lost productivity growth.
And how do you explain that?
Partly it's lack of investment. The other part of it is the pattern of immigration that we've been seeing in Canada. Now, there's a very strong case to be made and lots of evidence that a well-designed immigration policy should be productivity improving in the long run, right? But the design of that program matters a lot. And Canada's historical strength has been to bring in highly skilled workers from outside to supplement the labor force and improve productivity. But what we've seen over the last decade, and especially post-COVID, is a surge in immigration flows that has been so rapid that the economy hasn't been able to absorb it properly, or will take some time to absorb it, and which has created sort of adjustment shocks that has been very negative for Canada. So with all those workers flowing in, productivity per worker has actually declined. So they haven't been put to work in a way that's increased productivity. They are also a root cause, or this immigration wave and the pace of it is a root cause as well some of the challenges in the housing market. We just, put very bluntly, there are too many people in need of a house, and construction can't keep pace with that. And that's a big source of the rise in house prices, and more recently, the big surge in rental prices. So, and I think that's why you're seeing the government now starting to say, okay, we're going to stop increasing immigration targets. We're going to start tailing off. Over the last couple of years, though, Canada's population has grown by a whole % per year just on immigration. And it's very difficult for any economy to adjust at that pace of change smoothly. And I think we're seeing some negative effects of that as a result. Long term, time will tell whether that leaves Canada in a better position. Certainly, it counteracts issues around aging and demographics, issues around skill shortages. But again, much of the immigration has not been well tailored to where the skill shortages are. So you can speak to doctors who are saying, we don't have enough nurses, there are not enough teachers, and surpluses in other parts of the economy. So challenging, certainly, and that's I think the big picture behind what's going on. Meanwhile, inflation's collapsing, growth is very, very weak. The Bank of Canada should be cutting.
I still disagree with your comment on inflation collapse. I do not see it.
Well, prices won't go down, but they've stopped going up.
Even though the rate of change might be decreasing, it's still not going away. And okay, so you raised a few good points here, and I just want to touch on them. First of all, it's interesting to note this level of productivity, or this decline in productivity that's been happening for the last 9 or 10 years, corresponds to the time that the current Liberal government has been in office. So a lot of it is definitely being driven by the policies that they have implemented. The other interesting point that I want to bring up, you said about what's happening with the housing market. And just to quantify this for our American viewers, I want to put this into perspective for you, but we brought in over 1 million people last year into Canada in 2023. Keep in mind, we only have a population of 40 million people. Half of that 1 million people came into the city of Toronto, or the greater Toronto area, which is about 5 million people. So our population here increased by 10%. Just think of the stress that's put on the transportation system, the healthcare system, and so many other systems throughout the economy.
And by the way, I'm one of them, Jimmy. So you can blame me. I moved over from the UK.
Well, it looks
come
like you
my way.
are contributing to society here, to the economy. So I applaud you for that. I guess you came to Canada for the warm weather, or what?
Yeah, the beautiful warm weather, the excellent subway system in Toronto. That's what I'm here for.
And the low taxes.
Exactly.
Okay, so I want to touch on the housing market now. The last time I spoke with David Rosenberg, he made mention of the fact that he thinks there's a big reset coming in the Canadian housing market, okay? Because once again, I want to clarify this for our American viewers, but in the US, you can get a 20 or 30-year mortgage. We can't get that here in Canada. We can only get a 3-year or a 5-year mortgage. And David thinks that there's going to be a major reset coming here this year, maybe next year, when people go to refinance their mortgage, and the cost of that mortgage is going to go up significantly. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, Dave and I completely agree with that. And the numbers on this are pretty stunning, right? It's not just the housing market, it's what it does to the broader economy too. In the US, there's this whole argument about longer lags and why haven't higher interest rates had a bigger effect. Well, part of it is, as you say, the biggest interest rate exposure of most households is their mortgage. And if you're locked in at 3% for 20 years, you don't really care. In Canada, it's different. The longest you can get is generally 5 years. And so what we saw during COVID, when interest rates got basically down to zero, was a huge boom in the housing market where everyone tried to buy at those low rates, but also most of the housing market who was on a mortgage refinancing that mortgage. And so there is a wave of 3 to 5 year mortgages now, which is just coming due for a reset. And about 50% of homeowners haven't had any exposure yet to higher rates, but will between now and the end of 2026. So that is going to have an enormous effect on discretionary income in Canada. That's going to have a huge effect on the housing market, right? And the overall scale of the effect is going to depend on the timing and the balance between when the Bank of Canada starts cutting rates and how deep and how many people that brings into the market, versus how many people get scared away by mortgage rates still being quite high. But it's definitely clear that there are going to be a lot of people who can't afford to live in their house anymore, and that's going to bring a lot of supply onto the market. There will be some demand to pick that up, but in balance, prices should go down, and that should lead to a reset. And it will then be a question of sort of how low rates go as a result to pick that up again. On the other side of it is that those who do stick with their mortgage and accept that much higher rate are going to stop taking holidays, are going to stop all sorts of discretionary income. That's going to have a huge effect on consumer spending in Canada as well. So this coming wave of mortgage renewals is going to have enormous effects on the economy here, and is something that I think a bit more attention should be paid to.
So you paint a very ominous picture on Canada. What's it gonna take to turn this ship around?
Well, I think two things. One is that obviously interest rates need to normalize as the housing market normalizes, to be able to sort of restore the supply and demand balance. At the same time, housing market specific still, everything needs to be done at all levels of government and the private sector to improve housing stock, so that after this sort of initial clear out happens, those people who are still looking for a place to live affordably can find one. And then we need more structurally to address these other issues I've been talking about in terms of productivity and kind of economic vibrancy in Canada. I think a policy reset needs to happen there. I think there's been, I think you commented about the Liberal government. I mean, one way I would characterize them is to say ADD, a little bit, attention deficit disorder. They've been split all over the place. And good growth generating policy is always very focused on the big problems. The last time we saw like truly excellent policy like this in Canada would have been the Chrétien government of the 1990s, which focused its entire attention on bringing government debt and fiscal under control. And that led to a huge growth dividends. We then had a series of oil booms, which obviously helped everyone out. And since then, just a real lack of policy focus on the economy, which I think it's desperately looking for. And that was evident in the latest budget too. Probably our American listeners won't be too interested in that, but we could get into that if you'd like.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess the other thing I should highlight too, or remind our American friends, the taxes in Canada, I cannot tell you how onerous they are. Like your payroll taxes, depending on your income, you're looking at 50%. And then the thing that really kills me though, we're continuously being taxed on after-tax dollars. Every time you go fill up your car, every time you go to the liquor store and you want to buy a nice bottle of wine, doesn't matter what it is, food, everything, you're continuously being taxed. And then the other issue that this government did during the worst possible time, they implemented a new tax called the carbon tax. And it's just one more thing to bring down the Canadian consumer.
And capital gains. Yeah.
Forgot about that one.
A very large backdoor increase in capital gains taxes, which is hurting everyone, sort of, kind of small businesses or that kind of thing. And broadly, this is part of why Canada is becoming so uncompetitive in terms of trying to get business to occur locally. So it's one part.
So that begs the question: why did you move here again?
You'll have to ask my wife. She grew up just outside of Toronto.
Well, listen, this has been a fascinating conversation, a little bit depressing though about Canada, I have to admit. But if someone would like to learn more about you, Dylan, and also read your research from Rosenberg Research, where can they go?
They can go to rosenbergresearch.com. Nice and easy. You can find all of our research there. And for those not subscribed, very easy to get on a 1-month free trial to check it out. The other place, if you didn't get too bored of me, I do a weekly podcast called the Rosenberg Roundup. That's drops every Friday, and basically we just look back at the week's events. We also have occasional, roughly once a month, interviews with prominent investors, people in the financial markets. So you can find us there on Spotify, Apple, and YouTube as well.
Well, that's great. Once again, I do appreciate you making the time today, and I look forward to our next conversation.
Likewise, Jamie, it was great fun.